I hope that everyone had a lovely time last night. Matzah, maror, 4 cups of wine, and more brisket than your cardiologist would recommend. And I am truly impressed that you got up this morning and came to shul to pray. You have earned your privilege of this morning, so close your eyes and nod off. We're going to do it again tonight, the lunacy of diaspora Jewry. We get to do it all over again. So last night was devoted to the questions that our children ask us. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. And this morning I want to suggest to you that we recommend we take a look at some adult questions. Some of the really truly adult and difficult questions that the story, the narrative, and the tradition raises. So if you'd please put away the blue prayer books and take out the large red volume of the Chumash. In a moment or two, we will begin reading the beginning of the liberation story from Parshat Bo. But I want to ask you to begin to go all the way back to the beginning of the story on page 318, the first parak of Sefer Shmot, the first chapter of the book of Exodus. Because there is a question that concerns me this year that I think is truly difficult and disturbing. So look with me on page 318. This is the beginning of the narrative. Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzraim. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. He did not know the backstory of how the Israelites ended up in Goshen. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Hava nitchak malo. Let's deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they join our enemies and fight against us and rise up from the earth. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor and build garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so the Egyptians came to dread them. And the Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that made them perform ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter for them, with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and all sorts of tasks in the field. Much that we can discuss. But here's the question. What happened next? Okay, Pharaoh rose up and saw that he had this indigenous minority population of Israelites, and he was terrified of them, and he spun a conspiracy theory. It happens. You know, strangers in our midst won't be loyal to us. We need to do something about them. And so they imposed brutal slavery upon the Israelites in order to delimit their population. And what did the Israelites do? Did they write letters? Did they send delegations to the palace? Did they protest? Did they chain themselves to the gates of the palace? Were there marches in the streets? According to the Torah, what did the Israelites do? Nothing. They kept growing, but they did nothing. They did not respond. Why not? Why didn't they respond? Look again. Turn the page, and take a look at the next two stories. Look at verse 21 on page 321. Because the midwives fear God, God gave them households. And then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but every girl let live. So now he steps up the pressure. He steps up the campaign of genocide. He steps up the attack on this people. And what did they do? What did they do? There's no response. Why is there no response? I know Jews. You know Jews. Jews always have a kvetch. When Moses brought us to freedom, we kvetched. How come we didn't kvetch here? Why is there no kvetch? Why is it silent? Does that bother anyone? Why is it silent? It seems to be that they accepted it. They accepted it. They internalized it. They integrated with the system. They said, okay, these are the conditions. They integrated with it. It gets worse. Let's do one more. Turn to page 324. Page 324. You remember this story. So Moses grows up, and he comes out of the palace, and he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and a passion rises up within him, and he strikes down the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. Okay? Look at verse 13, please. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. And he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" And he retorted, "Who died and made you king? Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses was frightened. Vayomer, Mi samcha leish sar v'shofet aleinu. Now, you understand that what the Torah is doing is very slyly foreshadowing what's going to come next. Because that's exactly the question that the Israelites are going to ask Moses again and again and again as they go through the desert. As Moses takes authority over this people, that's the question they're going to ask him. In fact, the Medrash points this out because the Medrash identifies the speaker as Datan, as Dathan, or in the movie Edward G. Robinson. He's the guy that joins Korach in the rebellion against Moses in the book of Bamidbar. But now, for just a moment, read it in the context in which it is. The young prince of Egypt comes out to see the slaves, and he sees two slaves fighting, and he orders them to stop. And one of the slaves turns around and says, "What gives you any authority over me?" Does that seem a little strange to somebody? Because Moses is the prince of Egypt. You saw that movie. He's dressed that way. He carries himself that way. He speaks that way. He is the chief over these people. He has the power of life and death over these people, being Pharaoh's progeny. And yet the guy who asked him the question doesn't seem to recognize that. Why not? Why not? Why doesn't he recognize that this is the prince of Egypt and you're just a slave? You're nothing. You're invisible. You're negligible. You're nothing. Wait, one more verse, then we'll figure this out. Now go to page 325. Now come to page 325, and you have the whole story here. So Moses takes off, and he goes and lives in Midian for 40 years, watching the sheep of Jethro, and marries Tzipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the chief priest of Midian. And you see at the bottom of the text on page 325, before the last verse, there's a big white spot. Everybody see the white spot? And the reason for that is because there's also a spot like that in the Torah. There's a break in the story. And then it says, verse 23, please, right? Vayihi bayamim harabim. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. And the Israelites, ve'anachu, they were groaning under the bondage. They groaned under the bondage and cried out. And their cry for help from bondage rose to God. And God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Avram and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the Israelites and took notice of them. Finally, and for the first time, at the very end of the story, what happens? Come on, this is the audience participation part of our game. Finally, at the very end of the story, what do we hear for the first time? Not God. Leave God out for a second. Before you get to God, we'll get to God, I promise you. But before you get to God, what happens? What happens? What? They're kvetching. Right, very good. Very good. Thank God you know this word. The Israelites awaken, and they cry out. How come? Why did it take so long? And what's the connection between their awakened kvetching and the death of the king of Egypt? What's the relationship between those two facts? Let me ask you a very hard question, because now in the Medrash, in the rabbis' interpretation of this in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, what they said was that Up until now, the slavery was bearable. But as the king of Egypt began to die, he became more and more cruel, more and more arbitrary, more and more unfair, unjust. And that's why they suddenly start to cry when he was close to the end of his life. But it's the Hasidic tradition of the 18th and 19th century that really saw something much deeper in this story. Because the Hasidic tradition sees the entire Torah as a meditation on the inner life. And the rabbis of the Hasidic tradition ask a very painful question. Did they know they were slaves? Did they even know they were slaves? Is it possible that Pharaoh so subtly and so slyly and so stealthily and so shrewdly enslaved them, so by the time they were fully enslaved, they had no understanding that they were slaves? And so when he imposes ruthless labor on them, they accept it because, well, that's who they are. And when he starts to throw children into the Nile, they accept it because that's what happens in a society in times like ours. And when Moses approaches that Israelite who is beating on his friend and says, "Why are you doing this?" the guy turns and answers him sarcastically because he doesn't know he's a slave. Is it possible to be a slave and not know you're a slave? Is it possible that slavery becomes so normal, so regular, so typical? Thank you. It's the voice from Philadelphia. That it becomes unnoticeable. That's what the Hasidic tradition begins to wonder. Is it possible that we accept certain social conditions, and when they become normal to us, they turn invisible? And we simply live in that moment. We live in that moment, and we just say, well, that's the way it is. That's the way things have to be. There's no alternative to that. That's the way it is. The Hasidic tradition calls this the exile of da'at. Da'at is the Hebrew word for consciousness, for awareness. And Mitzraim, which is the name of Egypt, Mitzrayim literally means the narrowing. And what the Hasidic tradition understood is that Mitzrayim is the narrowing of consciousness to such a point that one becomes unconscious of one's place in a society and unconscious of the conditions that affect you in that society, and so they become normal. And so a slave people doesn't know it's a slave. So that when the prince of Egypt comes and says, "What are you doing?" the guy says, "You don't have any authority over me." But he's a slave. But he doesn't know he's a slave. And if you were to ask them, "What are you doing?" the answer would be, "We're doing what is right, what is normal. This is what's expected of us." Is it possible for a society to slowly and stealthily and shrewdly impose slavery upon people so they simply forget who they are and what they can do and what happens? And then why all of a sudden at the end, why do they wake up? Why do they wake up? We've seen that. We've seen this in our time. In 1895, a young Hungarian reporter working for a Vienna newspaper is reporting on a trial in Paris of a young French Jewish army officer who is accused of treason, and everyone knows that the charges are cooked, that the evidence is false. Everyone knows this. And yet he is convicted and marched out to the balcony of the École Militaire and shamed in front of the community, and the crowd below is screaming, not death to the traitor or death to the enemy or Vive la France, but the crowd below is screaming, death to the Jews. And this young man named Theodor Herzl wakes up and says, anti-Semitism, it's time to do something. We can't stay here anymore. And his consciousness awakens, And he writes a book called The Jewish State and launches political Zionism. Consciousness can awaken. Da'at can return. In 1954, after 90 years of legal segregation and domination and dehumanization and oppression and persecution in the American South, a young seamstress named Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, even though it was the black section of the bus, the colored section of the bus. And they take her to the police, and they put her in jail for disturbing the peace. And they give her a dime. For those of you young, that's a coin. We used to have telephones. And they let her make one phone call, and the phone call she makes is the young preacher in her church, who then leads a movement, the bus boycott of Birmingham, Alabama, which leads to the flowering of the American Civil Rights Movement. Her name was Rosa Parks, and his name, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. Consciousness can rise. Consciousness can rise. When I was a kid in school, in 1967, at Charles Evans Hughes Junior High School in Woodland Hills, California, boys took electric shop, wood shop, industrial drafting, and agriculture. And girls took cooking and sewing. How many times do you think I've used a lathe since 7th grade? How many meals have I cooked, and how many buttons have I sewn on? Right? Girls in that moment went to college not to get a BA or an MA, but to get an MRS degree. And then a Jewish lady named Betty Friedan rose up, and she wrote a book. And she said to women, rise up and recover your voice. And something changed in this society. Consciousness can rise. And the story of this liberation is a challenging story because it says you can lose your consciousness. Da'at can be exile. And then what is liberation? Well, here's one story. So this is from the Meshiloach, which is the Ishbitzer Rebbe of the 19th century. Immediately as their cry rose up, salvation began. You saw that in the text. As soon as they cried out, that's when God noticed. God didn't notice before, but God only noticed when they cried out. Till then, he writes, they had not had any arousal to cry and to pray because they saw it as normal, because slavery was normal, because oppression was normal, because this is what the times were all about. But since God wanted to save them, he roused them in a cry, and that's the beginning of redemption. For before God wants to save, one does not see one's lack. One is unaware of what one has not. But when God wants to save, God shows one the root of one's lack so that one sees that all the complexity of one's need is rooted in this basic lack, and he gives one the power of prayer, of crying out to God, and one begins to rage to God about it. Politically, what happened? Egypt was a static society. Everyone had his place on a social hierarchy. Everyone knew who he was and where he fit. It wasn't that you were a free person temporarily incarcerated. You were a slave. Just like a warrior was a warrior, and a nobleman was a nobleman, and Pharaoh was a god, and the society was static, and there was nothing else. And the loss of da'at in the Hasidic tradition means the loss of faith in a god. Now what that means is that in a static society, the society becomes God. The social hierarchy becomes God. And your position in the social hierarchy is metaphysically determined. It's not economically determined. It's metaphysically. You belong there. So that's why you don't protest, because you can't imagine anything different. You can't imagine freedom. That's Mitzraim. That's the narrowing of consciousness. And then suddenly the king dies. And suddenly the social hierarchy doesn't seem so static anymore. And in the Hasidic ideal, people recover a sense of God, that there is a God who is above the state, more powerful than the state, more powerful than the social hierarchy, more powerful than that supposed metaphysics that assigned me to this position. We just read Hallel. The cantor sang it so beautifully. Did you read the words? Me'afar yakimi dal. From the dust will come the poor and sit on the throne of the prince. Moshivi akeret habayit ema banim smecha. The woman who could not have children suddenly is the mother of a brood of children. To believe in a God is to believe in the plasticity of reality. It doesn't have to be this way. Or to put it in the most blunt words, what is not inevitable. What is not fixed. To believe in a God, the God of Hallel, is to believe that a slave people can rise up, run away from their slavery, cross a sea and be free. Or that a despised, broken, persecuted people, subject of the worst evil in all of human history, can form a state and gather their family from the four corners of the earth and create a culture and defend themselves and stand with dignity in the world. Me'afar yakimi dal. From the dust will rise up the broken ones. That's what it means to believe in the God of the Bible. That is the recovery of da'at, the recovery of consciousness, of awareness. It's a recovery of faith in a God of possibilities, a God of tomorrow, a God of openness. And that's what we learned on the far side of the Red Sea. And that's why last night and tonight we will sing again and again, over and over again, Ilu hotzianu me Mitzraim dayenu, and all the steps and the miracles, because each one of those miracles says that what is not what must be. God lives in this world and has purposes in our history and gives us the power to reshape that history, and nothing is fixed. And that is the da'at that Israel gained, first in Egypt and then through that across the Red Sea. So the painful, difficult question that we grown-ups have to ask this morning, beyond Manishtana Halayla Hazeh, is what are all the things we've become enslaved to? All of the ways of living, ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of acting, ways of identifying ourselves. What are all the things in our world that we have become so normal to us, they're not visible to us anymore? And what will it take to awaken us and to say, wait a minute, what? Wait a minute, what? That's what it is? This we have to do something about. When are we going to get to the other side of the Red Sea and look back and say, that's what we did? That's what we were? That's what became of us? That's what we accepted? That's what we tolerated? That's what we integrated? That's what we identified with? What, were we crazy? Awaken. Get up. That's what the story asks us to ask today, tonight, tomorrow, forever. The reading this morning comes from the 12th chapter, which you'll find on page 385. Chag Sameach.